Music 292, Weeks 10 and 11. Part 3, Composite Forms. Hello, class, to your last video for this unit. In this video, we're going to talk about composite forms, which are essentially small forms nested inside larger ones. Let's get started. Composite forms occur when one form is embedded within the sections of another. And the composite forms can actually feature any of the types of forms that we've looked at so far. They will feature large-scale binary and ternary sections that are themselves smaller-scale binary or ternary forms. So the diagram, I think, gets that idea across pretty well. What I've given here is an example of a possible what's called composite ternary form. Basically, the ternary form will have large sections, A, B, and A. But then inside each of those large sections, we can have another internal structure. So say, for example, your A section of your ternary, inside of itself had a smaller AB, A prime breakdown. We would have a rounded binary inside the section of our A. Any of the form types that we've learned so far can be these internal structures. Composite forms are very, very common in minuet and trio movements, or scherzo and trio movements, with the minuet being the A section, the trio being the B section, and the da capo back to the minuet being the return of the A section. So because of that, they tend to be really, really common in minuet and trios and third movements. One thing I want to point out before I start with some practical examples is that it's also possible for some sections to be composite and other sections to not be composite. So for example, I could have a composite ternary form that has my ABA of my ternary. My A section maybe breaks down in something like a rounded binary, but maybe my B section doesn't have any section divisions. It's just through compose. That's entirely possible. As long as one of the sections has composite structure, then we consider the thing to be composite ternary. Let's take a look at this in an actual piece of music. This is Beethoven's Piano Sonata Opus 28, third movement, and this score is going to go over 2 pages. So just be aware of that as you're working through here. You're not going to be able to see everything at once. We're going to be flipping back and forth a little bit. Let's listen to the full recording, and I want you to map out what you hear as the A material and where you hear that thing coming back. Noticed in doing that it seems like there's too many double bar lines for our form options that we've studied so far. And that's because there are some nested forms in this particular structure. So mapping out the A is going to help us in figuring that out. We know the very first thing that we hear is going to be A because that's just kind of how it works with form analysis. So let's go and put that label in. Looking for returns of the original melody gives us some indication of what we might want to label as A. You're going to need to decide in each case, though, whether it's going to be a large scale A or a small scale A. In other words, whether it's part of the bigger form or whether it's part of the smaller nested form. So places where you probably heard A were just around circle 50. I put that on the score. And then there's a sneaky one right at the very ending. There's an indication that says scherzo da capo, which means we go back to the original A and we repeat that until we hit the fine sign. This is, in fact, another statement of an A section. I think I mentioned this already in one of the previous videos, but this is the exception where a repeat is going to be taken into account when doing a theory analysis. Our next step is going to be to look for contrasting content. We're going to call that B, but it might be small scale, it might be large scale. Have another listen to the recording and map out where you think the B sections are happening. I'm going to guess you probably put that B label in two different places. You probably noticed the double bar line on the third system, and you saw that the stuff afterwards was contrasting to what came previously. We've got dotted half notes happening in our bass, and we've got a different primary rhythm that's coming through. It's not really featuring eighth notes so much anymore, it's mostly quarter notes. You also probably noticed another distinct shift in material at the trio, which looks very, very different. It looks almost like it's a completely different piece here. So both of those are going to be B in some kind of capacity. At this point, we need to decide which labels are large scale versus which are medium or small scale. Now, I'm just going to mention that I'm probably going to call these internal form divisions medium scales. I'm going to tend to reserve the term small scale for your phrase level analysis, things like your periods and sentences, for example. So when I say medium, I mean the embedded A's, B's, etc. How do we make that decision? Well, we're going to look for the amount of contrast, and we're also going to look at the overall section division. So are we expecting something to be a significant change? And so based on that, our first B material does have some contrast to the preceding A, but there's also some similarities. We've seen the quarter-quarter rest pattern before, and we've seen that particularly in the accompaniment of A. So we could argue here that it's maybe not as much contrast as the next B section. As a result of that, we may want to call this thing a small scale B. If we're going to use a small scale B, we should probably put the small scale A at the beginning as well. This means that when our A section comes back around circle 50, we're going to consider this a return of A within our embedded form. And in this particular case, I'm not sure if you noticed this yet or not, there are some modifications to this compared to the opening A content. Particularly the third system on the second half of the page, there's some significant changes there in terms of accidental and in terms of key. We're in D major here rather than the A major that we got to around circle 15. So that's going to add a prime onto this thing. So what does that mean overall? Well, it means we have an embedded rounded binary form inside of our big A section. All right, let's do this for the next page as well. This one's a little bit more of a challenge. We did notice a B section at the beginning of the trio, and this is very significant amounts of contrast. The rhythm is very different, the contour is very different, and even the key is different. This is now in B minor, whereas the earlier material was in D major and A major. So that suggests that this should get a large scale B. We're going to need to decide whether we think there's an internal form breakdown here. And this piece, it turns out, is a little bit of a gray area. Normally, we would put a sectional division at a double bar line. But the weird thing about this piece is that it doesn't actually contrast in any way. Look at the melody. It's the exact same thing. That's your A section. Stuff after the double bar line. So there's a slight shift in melodic direction, but that actually just alternates in different halves of the phrasing. So this is not super normal, but I think I'll probably call this thing B-like. There's a division because of the double bar line. There's a shift in terms of the harmony. This is not quite in B minor entirely in this section. But it's going to be a really, really weak B section since it doesn't really contrast much, particularly in the melodic aspect inside of my larger B section. I could also argue that this thing is through composed. That would also be a correct answer. So overall, this is essentially what we see in this piece. We have a composite ternary form because the A sections in particular have an embedded form. Our scherzo broke down into an A, B, and A prime section, making a rounded binary. Within our trio, we have a small A and a B-like, making something binary-like. Just in a quick aside here, I could have actually argued 3 sections in here as well. We can talk about it in the live class if you want to ask more questions about that. And then finally, in the da capo scherzo repeat, we had the same form that we saw embedded in the original A section, a small A, B, A prime to form a rounded binary. So we don't need the embedded sections to all be the same, but we do expect embedded sections in a repeat of A, for example, in a ternary form, to be alike. So that wraps up the analysis for this video. On perusal, you're going to start working on Haydn's String Quartet, Opus 76, number 4, third movement. And we're going to do something a little bit different this lesson. You're going to start this on perusal. You're going to get a certain number of things done, but then we're going to bring our work back to the live class to basically examine this in more detail. And so you're going to do some basic work at identifying some sections. You're going to start to look at phrase models, but then we're going to put it all together to get a large-scale picture of what's going on in this piece. It's essentially going to be a very in-depth analysis of the entire work. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the live class.